Run it, I can't take no loss. I don't even know what it costs. I hit the ground, then it go off. Yeah, hit the ground, then it go off. Yeah, I can't take no loss. I don't even know what it costs. Yeah, I hit the ground, then it go off. Yeah, hit the ground, then it go off. Yeah, run it. Ooh, I really feel it's my time, think it's my year. Yeah, I really feel it's.
Whaley has landed several of those inside lows.
Feel it's my time, think it's my year. Yeah, I really feel it.
Here we go. Short black trunks.
Yeah, I really feel it's my time, think it's my year. Yeah, I really feel it's my time, think it's my. Yeah.
It's been almost 30 years since the first UFC event took place in 1993 when Royce Gracie shocked the world by winning the tournament.
There's the tap. Royce actually had him in a choke.
Even though all his opponents outsized him by far, it wasn't just a fairy tale story, but he proved to everyone jiu-jitsu's superiority.
One of the fundamental strategies of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu.
Changing the game forever and showing that this martial art might be the most lethal weapon in MMA. Rightfully so, this sport has... This sport has seen hundreds of champions with a BJJ background, continuing Gracie's legacy. Who would have thought that?
He changed the face of.
Who would have thought that 20 years later, a new, not as known martial art would take over the world of MMA and produce dominant champions like never before?
From the way how Royce Gracie came to UFC and he make top everyone.
From the crazy mountains in Dagestan to the Red Square in Moscow, taking over the UFC. Taking over the UFC Sambo is arguably the most dominant martial art in MMA today, and its practitioners are the most feared fighters in the UFC. Why is Sambo so special?
I think somewhere he just wanted to pay respect to Sambo. I believe he got his skills that he got being Dagestani, and I believe he got them in a wrestling.
What are the specifics that make it so dominant and different?
And it's quite interesting, hey, it's like a combination of judo and BJJ, but you're not allowed to choke.
Let's start with its origin. Initially developed in Russia, the word Sambo derives from the Russian phrase SAMozashchita Bez Oruzhiya, which means self-defense without weapons.
Samos was based on classical boxing mixed with Greco-Roman wrestling.
Even though its initial use, as the name suggests, was for self-defense, through the years would turn into a lethal weapon in the octagon.
It wasn't anything groundbreaking, but it did establish a good, solid ground for the future development.
Sambo's development began in the 1920s with the Soviets' Red Army to upgrade their hand-to-hand combat skills. Just like hundreds of years ago, the samurai warriors developed jiu-jitsu to serve their purpose. It was Sambo for the Soviet soldiers to improve their fighting abilities.
What it looks like when you grapple with a two-time world Sambo champion.
The two founders and pioneers of this martial art were Vasily Oshchepkov and Vitor Spiridonov, intending to create a superior martial art that would be a melting pot of the most effective techniques of the other martial arts.
Guys, I can actually pull his arm out and drop him to the floor.
Obviously, during the Cold War, it wasn't only the military superiority that the Soviet Union was thriving for, but the world of martial arts as well. Oshchepkov and Spiridonov were separately developing two styles, completing each other.
With my knee, and I'm going to drive with this knee until he gets the leg out.
While Oshchepkov's style was involving strength and toughness, Spirionov's style was softer and less strength-relying. They were both very familiar with catch wrestling, judo, jiu-jitsu, striking techniques, and they were working on integrating the best techniques of each of these martial arts into one superior art that would dominate in hand-to-hand combat. And now, almost 100 years later, the name Sambo is involved in every conversation when it comes to the most lethal martial artist in the world today. Many UFC fans today are not aware of the existence of names like Dan Severn or Oleg Taktarov. Even Khabib Nurmagomedov himself, on multiple occasions, said that he wanted to be the first Muslim UFC champion.
Last thing you said, it's very important for you to be the first Muslim UFC champion. Why is that important for you?
Without being aware that 20 years before his time even began, it was Oleg Taktarov who became the first Russian Muslim UFC champion.
Nobody take this title before is with Muslim. Muslim had like more than 1 billion people, you know, that's why I think.
All thanks to his Sambo background. Oleg Taktarov.
4 or 5 years, we're gonna have 3 more UFC champions
Oleg Taktarov won the UFC 6 tournament, becoming the first Russian UFC champion. If you think Ronda Rousey's submission versus Kat Zingano was fast, executing it in just 14 seconds, then you should watch the fight between Taktarov and Anthony Macias. The Russian fighter holds the record of the fastest submission in UFC history, submitting Macias via guillotine choke in just 9 seconds on July 14, 1995 at UFC 6.
It was lightning quick.
It took just a tiny mistake by Macias to fall into Taktarov's hands when his Sambo instinct instantly turned and squeezed the victory out of his opponent. Dan Severn, on the other hand, is a UFC pioneer that does not need an introduction. He didn't ask for his nickname The Beast, but he earned it, finishing his MMA career with an outstanding record of 101 wins with only 19 losses. His Sambo credentials would lead him to become a UFC Hall of Famer, the only Triple Crown champion in UFC history, and with that, one of the leading pioneers, not only in the UFC but the whole mixed martial arts world as well. In the early 1990s, at the time when UFC was a relatively unknown organization, Jiu-Jitsu, wrestling, and Sambo were the three royal, most effective martial arts in the octagon. However, back then, Sambo couldn't become as popular as karate or boxing because it didn't get enough attention from the media due to the extensive coverage on sports TV channels at the time. People could learn about karate and boxing from movies, whereas most people outside of Russia had never heard of Sambo. It was Oleg Taktarov and Dan Severn, the two early Sambo pioneers in the UFC, that started bringing Sambo's name to the table, making people aware of its effectiveness and dominance. These performances would be an overture for the early 2000s to bring the most dominant and superior fighter the world of MMA has ever seen up to that point. Fyodor Emelianenko, a Sambo specialist and arguably the greatest heavyweight of all time, sprung from this tradition.
But in that era in which he was competing in Pride from 2002 on, he was truly unstoppable.
It wouldn't be right to talk about Sambo without mentioning the last emperor, Fyodor Emelianenko.
Fyodor always carried a certain amount of body fat, never hurt him.
We are talking about a fighter who brought MMA to another level, as previously mentioned.
He's never ripped, and he was the scariest guy alive for a while.
In the early beginnings of MMA, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fighters would dominate the MMA stage.
And saw who was truly the last man standing each time around with 10-minute first rounds in
And the only martial art that could neutralize the BJJ techniques was wrestling. Yet, BJJ was a riddle that not many could solve.
I always tell people, young men, get involved in martial arts, especially Jiu-Jitsu.
In the early 2000s, Antonio Minotauro Nogueira was the Pride heavyweight champion, beating everyone with his outstanding BJJ skills, and not even superior kickboxers like Cro Cop or brutes like Prime Bob Sapp could stop him. That was until a new sheriff in town arrived, a Sambo specialist that would dethrone Minotauro and rule the MMA stage for almost a decade. Fyodor not only beat Nogueira, but he dominated him in his own game at a time when going on the ground against Nogueira was the same as trying to wrestle a saltwater crocodile lathered in baby oil. Once again, Sambo proved to be a lethal martial art that must not be underestimated. Fyodor Emelianenko not only continued what Oleg Taktarov and Dan Severn started, but also brought respect to Sambo's name to be widely recognized all around the world. While Fyodor ruled in Japan, on the other side of the ocean another Sambo specialist emerged, becoming a UFC champion, Andrei Arlovsky. The Pitbull, to this day holds the record for most wins in UFC heavyweight history, 23 in total.
The octagon is a Sambo and kickboxing expert.
23 in total. Was this all a coincidence, or these were just early indications that slowly but surely Sambo will start to take over the world of MMA? It turned out the latter is true. The world of martial arts has evolved significantly in the last 2 decades. Nowadays, in the new era, one must not be a one-dimensional fighter to be able to compete against the elite of the elite. Thanks to the early development of Sambo, which was derived from all the best techniques of multiple martial arts, it keeps proving that its arsenal is one of the most effective in MMA.
And then there's peptides that increase your body's ability to grow.
The more we see the success and dominance of Sambo fighters in MMA today, the more we can relate to Khabib's message on his t-shirt back in 2013. If Sambo was easy, it would be called Jiu-Jitsu. Not that Jiu-Jitsu is easy, but back then when not many people were familiar with this martial art, the Eagle left a clear message that Sambo fighters are here to stay. Speaking of Khabib, is there a more dominant?
One of the scariest too.
Oh yeah,
he's breaking you mentally, and for me that is worse than anything.
Is there a more dominant champion in the history of the UFC? He has
it was like he was the only one in the cage.
It was like everything was inevitable.
He has never even bled in a fight, much less lost a bout, and some even believe that he never even lost a round. who can argue Khabib's controversial message now, when aside from...
And Khabib is so strong. He's been grappling since he was a baby.
Now, when aside from him, currently we have another as dominant champion, Islam Makhachev. He just beat the most feared grappler in the whole UFC, the one who...
Especially when it comes to grappling.
Oh yeah, man, Makhachev smushes people.
The one who holds the record for the most submissions and most finishes in UFC history.
All of his muscles are designed to squeeze and crush and smash. And
Charles Oliveira. It's not only about that he beat him, but the way how he did it. He defeated him in his own game, submitting him on the ground. How about Alexei?
Took him apart on the feet. Took him apart on the ground. Yeah. Like, that's how good Islam is.
How about Alexei Olenek, the only fighter to win by submission via Ezekiel choke? Leaving UFC aside, two of the current Bellator champions, Vadim Nemkov in light heavyweight and Yaroslav Amosov in welterweight, are Sambo practitioners as well. This is not a coincidence, and Sambo as a martial art is going to grow even bigger in the future, which leads to the question, why is Sambo so effective? The most important aspect of the sport of MMA is grappling. If you don't believe it, just ask the former boxing champion, James Toney, who fought only once in the UFC, and was brutally dominated on the ground by the wrestler Randy Couture. The reason why Sambo is so lethal is that it was a combination of the most effective martial arts today, jiu-jitsu, wrestling, and judo, implementing the best techniques of each of these styles into one superior martial art of Sambo. It focuses on takedowns, a variety of throws, sweeps, and most important, submissions, techniques that can be found in the three most essential martial arts that we just mentioned. Combat Sambo, on the other hand, besides grappling techniques, include strikes and...
Vittori with the triangle attempt, look at this! Oh!
Include strikes and kicks as well, the closest you can get to a real MMA fight. That's the reason why Sambo fighters can quickly emerge and make a transition into MMA. The difference between Sambo wrestlers and classic wrestlers is consistency. The American wrestlers tend to look for the perfect opportunity to duck under and shoot for a takedown.
With the left. Oh, ooh, good right hand by Barboza. Oh, you heard him! Oh my goodness!
If the takedown is unsuccessful, they wait for another good opportunity to try and execute it again. Sambo wrestlers, on the other hand, prefer chain wrestling. They would constantly move forward, keep their opponent under pressure, executing one takedown after another. If their first takedown is unsuccessful, they immediately shoot for another and another until the opponent is tired and finally gives up his position. Not many can withstand that kind of pressure, and even an elite fighter like Justin Gaethje, known for his takedown defense, could not stop Khabib's pressure, gave up his position, and got submitted on the ground immediately.
Oh, beautiful takedown by Nurmagomedov against the back. Wow.
The takedowns, ground control skills, striking, and variety of submissions make Sambo so effective in MMA today. And the overall objective of this martial art is to end the fight quickly. For 3 decades, Sambo fighters are proving their dominance in MMA, and nobody could dispute it anymore. And what do you guys think? Is this a martial art of the future that would always dominate the world of MMA? Or do you think that Sambo is overrated? Whatever the case, it certainly gave wrestlers and jiu-jitsu practitioners a run for their money.